Yeah, response video to a Fred video. Don't think too much. So it's sort of a contextualization of the argument so far kind of thing, and it comes down to this medium in some way, which is always relevant, right? And why is the world the way it is? I mean, why are the possessors of knowledge so possessive of their knowledge? Why aren't there even, I mean, I've sort of raised it before, there's very few credentialed people on this medium. Politicians, it doesn't matter what, you can go down the list, but there's certainly no scientists here, very few. And if they're here talking about some other subject than what their profession is, let's say. And certainly the academics aren't here. And because it's, they have to protect their copyright, is what the simple argument I would make is that they have no value if they give it away, and also they're vulnerable in this medium, to demonstrating that maybe they don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, I guess I would say that, I'm really cynical. Well, I've become really cynical on authority. I mean, I even up to like 15 years ago, I might have had a lot more respect for authority. I might have thought that presidents actually have to know something about something, that they might have been informed people, or that their staff might have been informed, that somebody might have had had some idea what they were doing, that there was some level of competence built into where people ended up. And I certainly thought that about like the judiciary, for example. I mean, I thought these were intellectuals, and through personal experience I found out that they're as anti-intellectual as you could possibly get. They're incredibly ignorant, isolated, insulated, elitist fucknuts. I mean, they're quite literally, I would argue, pathologically insane, many of them. Just for an example, because it's related to the other subject of the tobacco crap with the other assholes that you have to argue with on the internet in this preposterously inane and ugly manner, because it's the internet apparently, and that's what you have to do. Everything has to be done in a retarded, dirty, stinking, smelly, anus way, because that's the lowest common denominator, and everybody gravitates to it. They're forced to it. They're dragged to it by the chabiches of the universe. But anyway, so yeah, I had a a Superior Court judge, right, Harvard graduate. So he's not a minor credentialed person. He's a major credentialed person, a Harvard law degree, right? And he's conducting a case, and he says, I don't have jurisdiction over federal constitutional issues, which was absolute nonsense. All judges, traffic court judges, can listen to somebody when they argue in defense of themselves by a constitutional right, and they can make decisions based on whether a constitutional right has been violated. So he didn't know that fundamental piece of law, and then in the case, okay, so he says he doesn't have jurisdiction over federal law and the federal constitution. So he limits the case to state constitution and state law, and limits the argument to those things. And then, in his decision, reverses himself in his decision. So after he's closed the case to argument, he reverses himself, claims that he does have jurisdiction over federal constitutional issues, but has negated the ability of somebody to make the argument. And you're just saying, how could a Harvard graduate not know you can't do that? But that's absolutely preposterous, that a court judge cannot reverse themselves in the decision over the procedure. I mean, they can't make a procedural reversal in their decision. It's just flatly insane. And you just stand back and say, what did he just do? How does this make any sense? So anyway, I'm just using that as an example. So then you say, well, wow, Harvard graduate doesn't mean shit, apparently. Apparently they'll give a degree to any kind of buffoon or asswipe, as long as he's got a, junior on his name, or the third or something, because he's a fucking idiot. I mean, it's not, and the level of idiocy is This is what he's degreed in. This is the subject he's supposed to know, and he doesn't know it. Imagine what he doesn't know about the stuff that he's not degreed in. I mean, if he could be this stupid in the subject that's supposed to be his expertise, wow, stunning, right? Okay. So another little example would be, I saw Dawkins and that, is it Skinner? I don't know, the animal rights guy. There was a video of them having a conversation. And you're just amazed because this guy is like giving Dawkins the ABCs on the fact that animals are sentient. Like it never occurred to Dawkins that, oh yes, well all the mammals have big giant brains and that they might be having completely interesting emotional experiences and that they might be totally invested in their welfare and their pain and suffering might actually amount to something as significant as his own. And it's like the first thing that was shocking is that it never even occurred to him. And then his whole attitude was just, well, isn't that perhaps interesting? Maybe someday I'll give that some thought. And you're just like, what? You have a brain? No, you don't. I mean, how could you be this? You can't be this stupid. You're a fucking biologist and you don't know what the major functions of a brain are? And that one of the major functions of the sentient brain is feelings? Well, anyway. So yeah, authority starts to get, the authorities just keep demonstrating themselves to be fucktards. Alright, so now we're in this argument, and you're just claiming authority. You're just, to be serious, just spouting book titles and saying, okay, it's your expectation that I read your authorities. Now, that in itself is just, what the fuck? Yeah, I mean, really, do I really have to do that? I mean, is that really where knowledge is? I don't think it is. I think it is in textbooks, and I think it is in an argument you have to make. So I would argue that these subjects, by their very nature, can be talked about all the way to the base. You don't need to have degrees in advanced mathematics or in some other thing. There doesn't need to be a lot of pre-acquisition knowledge, because all of it can be explained and it can be established as premises. And that's sort of what you're arguing from. You're saying that you have some premises that you've accepted, and you're saying subvertly that you're challenging my premises, which are different than your premises, and you're saying that your authorities give you right to override my premises, because you're not making an argument against my premises. That's how I see it anyway. And I think it's perfectly possible to have that argument over what we establish as a premise. So, yeah, that's the, because it seems clear that you've accepted certain ideas in physics that I don't think have at all been proven. I don't think it's at all proven by any substantial evidence that photons are actually not in a position, that they don't have an exact position and an exact velocity. I don't think that's been at all proven. What's been demonstrated that we have no instrumentality that has any possibility to measure both those things on an individual photon. That we can measure one, but we can't measure both. And that has been established as, yes, we have no instrumentality that makes that possible now, because there's no way we can measure a photon or see a photon without substantially changing its position or its velocity. I mean, its direction. It's whatever. Yeah, direction. So, its character, let's just say, its general character, because I would argue that the photons all do have an individual character. They're not all the same. They have their own electrical potential, so to speak. But see, maybe that's getting into another premise. Is that feasible, possible, reasonable? And whether or not you accept it or not is sort of critical to what conclusions you draw in the end. Now, that's just got to be part of the argument. Now, every argument I make, okay, I provide the lineage of the conclusion. So if I'm stating something as a conclusion, I think 90% of the time have provided a clear lineage of why I think that's the truth. So I haven't just sit there and said, okay, this guy says it's true, Einstein says it's true, so therefore it's true. I mean, I haven't done that. And I don't think you need to do that in most of these conversations. And where it gets a little complicated is, you could have an example like, I mean, obviously some disciplines are much more demanding in terms of having, you can't fuck up. You could argue like programming is almost like that. You can't, you can't make a single mistake even in how you spell words in programming. It's, little semicolon versus colon. You can't make even minor mistakes. So, it's very explicit. And so the language you would use in describing things requires a certain, I mean, even all professional languages are probably like that. Yeah, there's a certain learning curve, so you have to sort of know what a function would be, or a subroutine, or certain basic language to get what somebody's conveying when they say this is the way something works. And so some of that, you can't necessarily teach the whole subject, but the subject is probably there to be taught somewhere in all this interconnected crap. You could probably find, some explanation rather than an authority. Yeah. But again, that's a subject where it doesn't really matter. There's no truth value to what's being stated, and there's no necessity in terms of some critical thing that needs to be understood. But like math, you sort of have to know how to multiply fractions or something before you can do calculus or some other kind of thing. I mean, there's certain preliminaries that you must have some knowledge of to be able to have a conversation on a certain level. And I guess that's what you're saying. There's a certain level of conversation. You're saying I violated some rules of that level of conversation, and I've done so in some kind of brutish, ignorant, colossally uninformed manner, and yet you won't identify those colossal errors or the criminality, the obvious criminality of how that error was made. Through some sort of arrogance or obnoxiousness or false confidence or all these other accusations you've made, where I don't accept any challenge to those ideas, where that's nonsense, and where I'm incapable of having a conversation or debate about those premises, where clearly I am willing, but I'm not willing to just concede to a Harvard graduate if he's wrong. And I mean, I guess that that's what it comes down to, is some sort of measure of credibility. Now, I might have taken you more seriously again before I saw you basically demonstrate what I thought was preposterous intellectual dishonesty. So, that's the other liability of doing this, is that there's points where we might argue something where we have violated the rules, compromised the integrity of what we're saying by saying something too bold or too aggressively, or falsely credentialed, or whatever the crime would be. And we're all vulnerable. Let's say even myself. Yeah, could be. But again, if you're always careful to always demonstrate the lineage of your premises, the lineage of the way you've mixed them together, the logic you've used, the analogies that you keep disqualifying it using. You say they're a valid form or the essential form of communication, and yet you say they have no value in other arguments. And in my opinion, they're incredibly useful in modeling. So the apple-orange model, these models do make it obvious what the hell you're trying to convey in terms of a problem that exists or how the thing functions. So anyway, then the subcontext of this whole thing, or the added context, is the fact that I have made these deliberate efforts to attempt to create atmospheres of conversation that are protected from insults and the bullshit that you pulled here and the bullshit that I pull often. You know, in terms of everybody being invested in their own credibility and status, and you know, defending that from, you know, what people might think are, you know, illegitimate slings and arrows and all that kind of crap. And people do incite it. I mean, obviously, you know, if you have 4 commenters talking absolute fucking shit, you know, rude, obnoxious crap, and then the 5th commenter shows up with which is a substantially more valid argument, but it's grouped in that pile of shit, and it's just you're just gonna connect it to it emotionally, and emotionally your impatience just gets so high that there's a point where you're just fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Okay, I mean, you start raising the bar of what somebody else has to bring in terms of a counter argument, because so many of the arguments are so baseless and such shit that you don't have the patience to deal with what might be a legitimate misunderstanding or a legitimate curiosity or whatever. And so that's all part of this atmosphere too, is that there's these pieces of shit that spew this crap, create such a cesspool and such a stench, you know, that it gets impossible not to be reactive and to be self-protective, because it's just so thick in the air, and you just have it's like you're a little bit nauseous, and somebody starts talking about, you know, whatever, bacon and eggs or something, and you're just like, yeah, oh God, you fucking cunt. You know, I mean, it's like you're just so full of it and so sick of it that anybody who's bringing any kind of contention is going to get kicked in the nuts, because you're sick of the vile poo that's being thrown. So yeah, and so how do you protect against that? Blah blah blah. So again, and so that's the subcontext here. Is I just find that so offensive that you would choose now, like I said, when I've deliberately attempted to create more elegant conversation, less hostile, and open it up to all kinds of like feedback, and let's work on this together, and let's get this, you know, and your cooperation is 0, and instead it's this anti-cooperation where you claim anti-intellectualism and, you know, make these broad-brushed, vacuous, empty accusations of lack of credentials because I haven't read the same authorities that you've read. Again, I would argue that these authorities, you know, they might know what they know, but sometimes they don't know shit about something else. I mean, even Einstein has had incredibly embarrassing moments of fucktardedness. You know, when he was, you know, remember when he was, you know, that famous little point where he was saying, you know, your odds of splitting an atom are, you know, shooting sparrows in the dark blindfolded with your pajamas on inside out, or whatever the fuck he said. You know, and 6 months later a guy comes up with, you know, neutron goes in, 3 neutrons come out kind of bullshit. Chain reaction is invented. So anyway, so whatever. I think you've asked for a fight, and I don't think you're reacting to one. I don't know, like, again, you're not pointing this critique. You're just saying that you have a problem with my credentials. You're not saying you have a problem that you're not defending it with anything specific. And how can I take such an inspecific claim of I have authority to judge you claim seriously when you haven't proven that authority? You haven't proven a competence. You haven't proven that you're particularly good at pointing that out in other people, frankly. I mean, I haven't seen you do much engagement with people where you actually do argue with what they're saying and defeat them, demonstrate their ignorance. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't, you're saying you're the better gladiator, and that's all, and people should trust you. And I'm arguing exactly from the other position. I'm saying nobody should trust anybody. And if you can't understand this stuff, well, then you ought to just declare yourself a retard. but really, you really ought to understand it from the ground up. You shouldn't take my word for anything. You shouldn't take anybody's word for anything. You should either understand it or say you don't understand, that you don't care to be informed enough to draw a conclusion about whether the world's round or not, or whatever the subject is. You don't care to understand enough to be able to draw a conclusion. And then you should just shut up. You know, I don't see any point in you saying, I'm going to vote for this guy or I'm going to vote for that guy, when you don't understand the subject. It's like the voters, you know, they don't understand the policy, they don't understand shit. They just vote for a guy because he looks good, or he doesn't have a beard, or he doesn't have them squirrely eyes. I mean, absolute bullshit decides who they choose, because they have absolutely no competence, have no understanding of anything, political or social or economic or whatever the thing is. They don't care to understand any of the foundational shit, and yet they will opine on who's in authority. Yeah, so that's bullshit. I mean, some of that you have to do in life. I mean, there's just no way to get around it, right? You have to pick like you were saying, a mechanic, or you have to pick a doctor, you have to pick something, and there's no way you can test them in some real way, so you have to make a judgment based on some impression, and that sucks. But you can certainly find out pretty quickly, you know, whether their credentials mean anything. So anyway, but yeah, you know, I find it rather tedious to have to defend any aspect of my personality or any aspect of my credentials when all the arguments I make are ground up arguments, and the premises are, I mean, suffering sucks. I mean, you know, I have to defend that premise, and it seems I only have to defend it when somebody doesn't like the conclusion I'm drawing. Then they go back to the sources and say, oh, okay, yes, that's where you're wrong. That suffering sucks thing is bullshit. So that's the evasion part of it, right? They don't, the premise that suffering sucks is fine when they're talking about the stuff they're using suffering sucks to defend. But as soon as the argument is against what they think, and a fundamental key component is the idea that suffering does in fact suck, now all of a sudden they're going to, because they can't attack any of the logic on top of the premise of suffering sucks, now they'll attack the premise. And that happens all the time on YouTube. But anyway, alright, so yeah, my advice to you is make a better argument, more specific argument. Shut the fuck up.